What if Starfleet's greatest secret isn't a weapon, a war, or some forbidden technology, but an entire civilization that was never supposed to exist in the Prime timeline? Because the moment the Enterprise encounters the Martians and the Dull Drum, Strange New Worlds quietly opens a much bigger question than whether these aliens are friend or enemy. Why would Starfleet need to hide them at all? And more importantly, what happens if humanity discovers that there is another version of its own history unfolding somewhere beyond the boundaries of what Starfleet considers reality? That is where this story becomes much darker. The Martians aren't simply another strange species Pike's crew has encountered. They represent a problem that Starfleet cannot solve with diplomacy, phasers, or a treaty. They represent information. And in the Star Trek universe, information can be more dangerous than any weapon, because once humanity learns something about its own possible future, it becomes almost impossible to stop people from changing the present to reach it. The first clue is the way the episode treats the Martians and the Doldrum. Strange New Worlds could have introduced them like any ordinary alien civilizations, given them a conflict, allowed Pike to negotiate a solution, and moved on. Instead, their existence is surrounded by the feeling that something about them does not belong in the normal history of the Federation.
Federation doesn't exist.
That's not entirely true.
That distinction matters. Star Trek has encountered countless civilizations that are more advanced than humanity, more dangerous than humanity, or completely different from humanity. None of that automatically creates a timeline crisis. But a civilization connected to Mars and humanity's own evolutionary or technological history is different. Suddenly the question isn't simply, who are these people? It becomes, why didn't we know about them? And that is the question Starfleet would have to fear most. Because if the Martians have existed alongside humanity for generations, then somebody has been hiding something. And if they haven't existed in the Prime timeline until this point, then their appearance becomes even more disturbing. Either way, Starfleet has a problem. If the Martians are an ancient civilization that humanity somehow forgot, then Earth's history has been manipulated. If they originate from another branch of reality, then Starfleet has just encountered evidence that the Prime timeline isn't as isolated as everyone believes. And if the Doldrum are connected to that same phenomenon, then we're potentially looking at something much larger than a single alien encounter. We're looking at a system of civilizations that may exist outside the historical boundaries of the Federation itself. That would explain why Starfleet would want the truth buried. Think about what would happen if ordinary humans discovered that there was another civilization associated with Mars that had survived outside the official record. Mars isn't some distant planet at the edge of Federation space. It's humanity's backyard. It is one of the most important worlds in human history. The Federation was built on the idea that humanity eventually reached beyond Earth and became part of something larger. But imagine learning that something was already there. Something connected to humanity's own home system that Starfleet either couldn't explain or deliberately refused to explain. The political consequences would be enormous. Scientists would want access to the Martians. Governments would demand information. Starfleet would be forced to answer questions it might not even have answers for. And that is where the Prime timeline becomes the real danger. Because Star Trek has always treated time as something fragile. The Federation has repeatedly encountered alternate futures, temporal incursions, alternate realities and civilizations that exist under completely different historical circumstances. The biggest lesson is always the same: knowing what happens next can change what happens next. Once someone knows the future stops being inevitable. And if the Martians possess knowledge that humanity isn't supposed to have, then revealing them could create a chain reaction Starfleet cannot control. One discovery leads to another. Scientists begin investigating. Governments begin competing. Someone attempts contact. Someone else tries to steal technology. Eventually, someone tries to reproduce whatever allowed the Martians to exist outside the accepted timeline. That is how temporal contamination begins. And this could explain something even more important about Starfleet's behavior. They don't necessarily need to believe the Martians are evil. They only need to believe that humanity isn't ready to know they exist. That distinction changes everything. Starfleet has always presented itself as an organization built around exploration and truth. But there are moments when even Starfleet understands that revealing the truth can be destructive. The temporal prime directive exists for exactly this reason. You don't interfere with history simply because you have the ability to do so. You don't give primitive civilizations advanced technology. You don't reveal information that could radically alter their development. But what happens when the civilization you're protecting from that information is your own? That is the uncomfortable question this storyline could be setting up. What if Starfleet eventually realizes that the Martian secret isn't being protected from the Martians? It's being protected from humanity. And the doldrum could be the missing piece. The doldrum shouldn't necessarily be viewed as just another alien species introduced to make the universe feel bigger. Their presence could establish that whatever is happening around the Martians isn't isolated. There may be multiple civilizations caught in a phenomenon that Starfleet doesn't fully understand. Perhaps these species occupy regions of reality where the normal rules of history don't apply. Perhaps they have experienced timelines collapsing and reforming. Perhaps they know that the prime timeline is only one possible version of events. And if the doldrum know that, then Starfleet has an even bigger reason to keep them hidden. Because imagine what happens when humanity discovers that the prime timeline isn't unique. For centuries, humans have built their identity around progress. Earth becomes a spacefaring civilization. Humanity joins the Federation. Humans become captains, admirals, scientists, and explorers. But if the Martians demonstrate that another version of humanity or another civilization connected to humanity followed a completely different path, then suddenly the Federation's history becomes just one possibility among many. And people would start asking the most dangerous question of all: why did we get this timeline? That's the question Starfleet could never allow to become mainstream, because once people start comparing timelines, they start comparing outcomes. Why did one civilization survive while another collapsed? Why did one version of humanity develop faster? Why did one federation exist while another never formed? What technologies did they discover? What mistakes did they avoid? And eventually, someone will decide that the prime timeline needs to be changed. That is exactly the kind of scenario Starfleet would consider catastrophic. And there is another clue hiding in the very concept of secrecy. Starfleet doesn't have to erase the Martians from existence. It only has to control who knows about them. That is much easier. A classified report here. A restricted database there. A mission officially marked as something else. Pike's encounter disappears into a temporal archive, accessible only to a handful of admirals. The Enterprise crew is ordered never to discuss what happened. Years later, almost nobody remembers. That would explain how such an enormous discovery could remain hidden. But here's where the theory gets really disturbing. What if the secret eventually becomes one of the reasons the prime timeline survives? Starfleet may know that revealing the Martians triggers something. Maybe their existence becomes a point of divergence. Maybe humanity's attempt to contact them causes a war. Maybe their technology introduces a temporal instability. Maybe the Martians themselves are fleeing from another timeline and accidentally bring something with them. Or perhaps the doldrum already know what happens when civilizations interfere with this phenomenon. And Pike, being Pike, would probably want to tell the truth. That's what makes him dangerous to the people above him. Pike isn't the kind of captain who easily accepts because Starfleet says so. He believes exploration has meaning. He believes people deserve to know the truth. But if he discovers that telling humanity about the Martians could destroy the timeline he's trying to protect, he would be forced into an impossible decision. Does he obey Starfleet and hide something from humanity? Or does he reveal the truth because secrecy itself violates everything the Federation claims to represent? That conflict would fit Strange New Worlds perfectly. Because the real story isn't necessarily about Martians attacking Earth. It's about whether the truth itself is dangerous. And if that is where Season 4 is heading, then the Martians could become one of the most important secrets in the entire Star Trek timeline. There is also a darker possibility. What if Starfleet didn't discover the Martians by accident? What if somebody wanted the Enterprise to find them? That changes the entire story, because if the Martians and Doldrum are connected to another timeline, then someone with knowledge of that timeline could intentionally manipulate Pike's crew into making contact. The Enterprise might believe it is investigating an ordinary anomaly, while someone else is using Starfleet's curiosity to breach a barrier that was deliberately placed between realities. In that scenario, the Martians aren't the threat. The person who wants Starfleet to discover them is. And that could explain why the mystery feels bigger than the episode itself. The Martians may not be the villains, they may be the evidence. Evidence that somebody has been moving between timelines long before Starfleet realized it was happening. And if that's true, then Starfleet's decision to hide the Martians isn't simply about protecting the public. It's about hiding the existence of a much larger war over the prime timeline. Because once you know another timeline exists, you have to ask who controls the borders between them, and who benefits when those borders disappear. That's why I don't think the Martian secret can simply end with Pike returning to the Enterprise and Starfleet filing another classified report. The bigger story is what happens after the crew realizes what they've actually found. The Federation has spent centuries believing that its history is something that happened naturally. But what if parts of that history were engineered? What if certain civilizations were deliberately removed from the record because their existence threatened the stability of the timeline? And what if the Martians are the first piece of evidence that exposes the entire system? Suddenly, Starfleet's secrecy makes sense. They aren't hiding the Martians because they fear them. They're hiding them because the truth about the Martians could make humanity question everything it believes about its own history. And that's the terrifying part. The prime timeline might not be protected because it is the correct timeline. It might be protected because it is the surviving timeline. So the real question isn't whether Starfleet will reveal the Martians. It's whether Pike will eventually discover that Starfleet has been protecting humanity from a truth that humanity was always going to uncover. And if the Doldrum know what that truth is, then Pike may already be standing at the edge of something far bigger than a first contact mission. Because once the secret comes out, there may be no way to put history back where it belongs. And Starfleet may be hiding the Martians not because they're afraid of what the Martians will do to humanity, but because they're terrified of what humanity will do once it learns the Martians were here all along.